What happened the time you saw the fury of a patient man? Story number 1. I and a few of my friends used to frequent a pub in my hometown. It was a small place in the town center, a traditional English pub, complete with an attractive barmaid and consistent regulars, us included. Every time we were in there, a guy would be sitting at the bar, in a zone, with a half of bitterness. He'd occasionally join the banter, but was never loud or drunk. He was a nice bloke, always said hello and smiled. We knew him only as Ray. Now Ray was about 60, but fit. Not big, just a normal-looking guy. A few forearm tattoos, pretty standard for the north of England in the 90s. One Saturday afternoon, me and 4 of my friends were having our usual couple of drinks. As it was Saturday, there was a football match on. 3 away fans walk into the pub. Already a brave move. But this is a friendly place. Everyone eyes them suspiciously but carries on drinking. They walk to the bar and immediately start being horrible to the barmaid, making lewd comments, complaining loudly about the beer, etc. Ray looks at these 3 guys and says, "No need to be rude, boys. She's here to do a job." Cue a stream of verbal abuse from the away fans. "Shut the fuck up, granddad. What you gonna do about it?" etc. The regulars are having none of this. Everyone, me included, stands up and stares at these idiots. Ray turns to everyone and just says, "Sit down, lads. I'll deal with this." Turns to the away fans, "You 3, outside now." These 3 guys, obviously there for a fight anyway, are all, "Fucking come on then, granddad. Let's go." They all walk out of the bar and not 20 seconds later, Ray walks back in. Without a word, sits back on his stool and sips his half of bitter. Curiosity got the better of us, so we all ran outside to see complete carnage. 2 guys out cold on the pavement, one on his backside with blood pouring out of his nose. It turns out that Ray was an ex-SAS, and the barmaid was his daughter. Story 2. Working in an auto parts warehouse, one of our managers was very quiet, collected person. One particular day, some of the orders were wrong and the ordering system was malfunctioning. He calmly goes out back, starts up a forklift, and rams it full speed at a huge stack of wood pallets. He must have thrown it in reverse and repeated this about a dozen times, raising and lowering the forks appropriately. Everyone stopped working to watch as every last pallet was destroyed. When there was only a pile of wood scraps left, he turned off the lift and calmly walked back in and continued working as if nothing happened. Story 3. I didn't witness this, but my dad told me a story about his grandparents. My great-grandpa and grandma were British and came over sometimes in the 60s, I think. My great-grandpa fought in the Somme War during World War I and got captured by the Germans and held as a POW, so he had been through some shit. He was very quiet, generally pretty nice, but couldn't hear much. My great-grandma liked her sherry and was always nagging him and hassling him. So one day my dad and his siblings were at my great-grandparents' house. My great-grandpa was sitting in his chair by the fire, smoking his pipe while my great-grandma was going on about something. He was generally just ignoring her when she grabbed one of those fire pokers and threw it at him. He had his hands resting on the arms of the chair and the poker got wedged into the chair right in between his fingers. Didn't hit him though. So my great-grandpa quietly and unfazed got up, pulled the poker out and put it back in its place, and sat back down and said, "You won't be doing that again now, will we?" Apparently my great-grandma was just petrified, because he never said anything remotely confrontational. Story 4. My grandfather is a saint. My grandmother had a 99% fatal blood cancer back in the late 60s. They went to Cleveland Clinic as a last hope option. Neither were religious, but they prayed that night, and he promised to live his life as the best Christian possible if my grandmother was cured. 2 weeks later, while still waiting for treatment options, there was no blood cancer detectable anymore. So he's that kind of good Christian man. My aunt was 12 and she and the neighbor boy were making out on the couch. According to her, no hanky-panky. Well, the rumor mill went full tilt and the neighbor boy's mom comes over to the house to accuse my aunt of being a whore. Aunt opened the door and the lady called her a whore. Well, my grandma was in the kitchen and took off running. Spread the lady off the front porch and into the front yard and started beating on her. This isn't crazy. My grandma was fury bottled into a 411 frame. Well, neighbor's husband comes over to break it up and pulls my grandma off, then drew back like he aimed to hit her. My grandpa walked onto the porch about this time and said, "Buzz, if you hit my wife, I'll kill your whole damn family." Everyone I've talked to about the incident said the calmness in his voice is what gave them shivers. I've even talked to the old man Buzzard about it, and he tells it just like everyone else does. My dad said he had absolutely no doubt that my grandpa would have done it. He's never said anything and not done it. Story 5. One of my school teachers was the most patient, kind man who would work with you until you got something, even if it meant he had to miss his lunch. There was this girl who was a mouthy little shit. She would mess around in his class repeatedly. He always kept his cool even when she was being incredibly rude. Discipline never worked on this kid. I don't know how she didn't get expelled. One day she was drinking Coke in chemistry class and he repeatedly told her to stop because we were messing around with the chemicals and there was a contamination risk, but she didn't listen. After months of this kid giving him shit, he slowly walked over to her desk, picked up her Coke and poured it over her head, then walked back to the front of the class and carried on teaching. He got fired, much to our protestations. Story 6. My brother-in-law is a really soft-spoken guy that really kind of keeps to himself. That said, he's also huge, and built like Bam Bam Bigelow for all you 80s wrestling fans out there. In addition, he's covered in tattoos and on his head, neck, and everything, so you can imagine he's a pretty intimidating guy, which is why his soft voice and very chill demeanor can be really surprising. We're in a movie theater enjoying a flick when the kids behind us start acting up and throwing popcorn, talking, and generally making a ruckus. My brother-in-law stands up, turns around, and asks them to quiet down since they're disturbing everyone else. They behave for 15 minutes or so, but then slowly start acting up again. He stands up without a word, grabs the lead instigator by the throat, lifts him out of his chair one-handed, pulls him in close and growls, "Shut the fuck up," and sits him back down gently. The rest of the movie was very peaceful. Story 7. When I was in high school, an upperclassman at my all-male student Catholic school followed a female teacher into the bathroom and tried to rape her. She screamed initially before he pulled a knife on her. The gentlest, most caring, socially awkward Latin teacher heard the scream and rushed from his classroom straight into the woman's restroom. He clocked this kid across the face and dragged him out by his collar into the hall. Then he checked on the traumatized female teacher. Later, he just went back to class and continued teaching as though nothing happened. Dude knows 7 languages, has never dated anyone, and is brilliant, always calm man. People gained a lot of respect for him after that day. He's still really weird though. Story 8. Gym class in high school, the quiet nerdy kid kept getting picked on during dodgeball. One jerk kept hitting him with balls even when he was already out. The quiet kid wasn't tiny, he was about average sized, maybe a little taller than average. He eventually lost his temper, ran across the court, and literally delivered a double-handed chokeslam to the jerk. Being a bunch of teenage boys, we all lost our shit cheering for him. He got suspended for 3 days, but it was reduced to 1 day in school after a bunch of us went to the principal and explained the circumstances. Story 9. Back in uni, one guy I knew on greeting and small talk terms but not much more was known as the literal rock against the waves. Childish freshmen picked on him for being retarded and all, for ages, and he just shrugged it off. You need to imagine him as a gentle giant, 6'9"-ish and with arms as thick as my thigh, but very sweet and lovable. Hobbies including caring for shelter kitties and posting reviews for oddly specific music theory books online. I eventually became friends with him, and we hung out sometimes, grabbing a coffee and such, and one day we were avidly discussing something when 3 of the childish freshmen came by and pestered him. He informed them twice that we were currently talking and they should not disturb us. Please and thank you. With foreseeable success, so he just shrugged and tried to continue our talk over the pestering. Frustrated that they did not succeed, one of them resorted to the last straw of a childish bully and called his mother a whore. Fun fact, his mother died when he was 14 and he never fully came to terms with it. He took a deep breath, stood up, and grabbed the offender by his head, swinging him like a club at the others and kicking them into next Tuesday when they all were on the ground before I and 2 others could finally pull him off, and he instantly calmed down. Story 10. My grandfather was a man who rarely talked and never rushed. He once had a completely silent argument with my significant other. They slammed the back door at each other until they broke the window in it. They said he was a steel worker who worked for a moving company on the weekends. He was short but built like a brick house. When I was very young, I don't remember what led up to it, but I remember my father making my grandmother cry. Then I remember my grandfather charging in like a bull, grabbing my father and pitching him across the house. My dad made a good decision and bolted as soon as he got up. That was the only time I saw my grandpa lose his temper. Story 11. My grandfather is a nice, funny, flirty guy. Was an exec at a manufacturing business after being the 3rd employee. Everyone gets along with him, and he was fairly well off in my small town. One day my cousin and I are helping him with some work. We go to the store. There's a lot of poverty in my hometown and one of the poorer families was at the store. My cousin makes some comment. He was kind of a shit at this point about them being poor in what they were doing at the store because they couldn't buy anything or something along those lines. My nice grandfather grabs him and slams him against a wall and says, "Nothing in your life makes you better than them. Right now, I'd rather have them buy me than you." He then makes my cousin apologize and my grandfather announces my cousin will pay for whatever they're getting. He makes my cousin work off the expenses for him to prove a lesson. Now that cousin is a stand-up social worker specializing in poverty, abuse, and rehabilitation. The only time I have ever seen my grandfather be aggressive. Story 12. I was bullied in school. Not as bad as most, but it still happened. 2 cases come to mind. And the judo champion of our school was one of the biggest culprits for picking on me. One time we were heading up the stairs to our French class on the top floor. He grabs me in a bear hug from behind, locking my arms to my side. The only course of action left to me was to throw my head back, cracking him on the bridge of the nose. Another time, he put a plastic bag over my head, a thin one. I think it mostly ripped just by him trying to force it onto my unwilling head. It was only after I pushed him into a corner of a table that he stopped. In both cases, violence was the only option open to me, and in both cases, it prevented that situation from happening again. Both these incidents were just the final times this happened. The bear hug going up the stairs was a particularly favorite trick of his. I'd spoken to teachers about him and others, but it was just blown off. I guess because the biggest bullies in my year were most of the fucking prefects, with the head boy being the ringleader, but because it was all their word against mine. Story 13. My uncle is the most peaceful person I know. He is essentially a living version of what would happen if you combine General Iroh, Bob Ross, and Dr. Dolittle. He keeps a garden, feeds wild birds out of the palm of his hand, has been known to just walk up to a deer without it running away. I've never heard him raise his voice except to talk to someone really far away in my entire life. He was in the military during Vietnam, not sure what branch. He never saw a combat zone. He was the guy who fixed stuff that came back from a combat zone. The war ends, he goes home and returns to his normal life working at a tire factory. One night, he's going off a hard day at work and wants a drink, so he goes to the local bar. 3 guys are standing outside talking amongst themselves, and he goes to walk in, but they stop him. He tells them he doesn't want any trouble. He's just had a stressful day at work and wants to grab a drink. They go back and forth for a while, and eventually he just pushes past them to get in. They didn't like that, and pulled him back, where he proceeded to knock one unconscious and floor another. The third backed off and let him inside. By the time he left, they were nowhere to be seen. Story 14. I knew a girl who was living with a guy who had a severe anger management issue. He had kept it under control for the few years they lived together, but one day he snapped over some minor issue, hit her repeatedly, banged her face in the concrete, and tried to choke her until a passerby stopped him. So the relationship was over, and she was going to fetch her stuff from the apartment. She likewise obviously didn't want to go alone, so 2 other friends and her brother, who I also knew, tagged along to keep things in check and to help carry stuff. When we arrive, her ex gives us an attitude, which causes her normally extremely mild and docile brother to snap completely. He smacked the guy up against the wall with one hand and punched him repeatedly with the other, holding him up against the wall the entire time, because you don't hit someone who is down. We just stood there in shock and awe. Given the way the girl looked after the beating she had received, black and blue, bruised, her entire face scraped, choke marks around the neck and so on, we didn't much mind about what was going on and just let him punch him out. Then we got our stuff and left as he started to wake up. 2 times during the following months, the ex was jumped twice when moving outdoors in the evening. I don't know who did it, and I don't want to know. I guess everybody has their trigger. Story 15. Greg versus Jimmy. This one guy who was in our year at school was gigantic. We'll say his name was Greg. Greg hit 6 feet tall at the age of 15 and had a beard coming in a few years before that. It was intimidating as hell, but he was the nicest guy you'd ever meet. I still have a ton of time for him all these years later. Genuine model of a good person. Anyway, he was being teased all year by this asshole of a boy. Let's call him Jimmy. Jimmy had some self-esteem issues and used to pick on younger kids constantly. But when he set his sights on gentle Greg, knowing he wouldn't retaliate, it got interesting. Jimmy was rarely in school but would still hang about the school gates with about 6 or 7 pals waiting for Greg to appear, then bolt when they finally did. One weekend, we were all out street drinking, as you do, and Jimmy and company jumped Greg. Greg went mental. A couple of Jimmy's pals held us back while Greg managed to knock out 4 of the guys clean out before they brought him down. It was like watching the Hulk fight. Jimmy obviously bolted before the actual fight began. The next Monday at school, he was back to his usual self again, or so it seemed. I didn't witness the next part myself, but I wish I did. Greg hit Jimmy with an uppercut so forceful that he was launched across a school desk and was advised to leave education. Justice. Story 16. My father-in-law is such a patient man. He's quiet, reserved, and has a great sense of humor, when my mother-in-law lets him get any words in anyway. My mother-in-law talks a lot. She'll ask you questions, and when you start to answer, she talks over you and tries to answer them herself. It's infuriating and obnoxious. One time she asked me a question and I started to answer her, and she cut me off to basically finish my answer for me, and starts to ask another question. Lather, rinse, and repeat for about 4 questions. Finally, my patient, quiet, laid-back father-in-law just explodes on her, basically screaming at her. "Mother-in-law, oh my god! Let her actually answer the question you asked. Stop interrupting. You never let anyone finish their thought." It was glorious, and I almost tackled him to hug him. She still does it, but that day was amazing. Story 17. My dad was a career Army officer. I've always known him as a soft-spoken, kind, never gets angry kind of person. He rarely ever raises his voice that I know of. There is a law in the US that basically protects any service member nearing 20 years from being forced out so they can get full retirement benefits. One day he gets a call from his commanding general telling him that he's going to be forced out due to budget cuts army-wide. He got up out of his seat and started yelling at the general on the phone that it was impossible due to the law since he was in the safe zone. He started quoting section after section, yelling at the general, telling him he had fucked up and that it better be fixed. A few days later, my dad got a call again from the general, and the first thing the general said was, "Before you say anything, let me apologize for the other day. You were 100% correct. But budget cuts are budget cuts, and as soon as my dad hit 20 years, he was retired." Story 18. When I was in elementary school, I was being bullied at recess, and the teacher or monitor wasn't doing anything about it. My dad didn't work a traditional office job. He made his own schedule, which let him have a lot of flexibility. After getting the runaround at the school, he was referred to some bureaucrat at the district offices. Well, this guy did not want to meet my father, so despite my dad making an appointment, he wasn't in that day. Fun fact, that excuse doesn't work very well when you have labeled dedicated parking spots. The appointment was at 2 p.m., so my dad blocked the car in, rolled down the windows, pulled out a book, and started reading. At around 7 p.m., he hears the cough of a man who wants to get someone's attention while not being obvious about it. Oh, look at that. The bureaucrat showed up at the office and is ready for his 2 p.m. appointment. Story 19. My father, who had a legendary temper and never lost it in front of me, was sued for malpractice by this insane patient, the epitome of an ambulance-chasing lawyer. We were in the car and we saw the lawyer, and my father said, very evenly, although boiling with rage, "If you weren't in this car, I'd crash right into that piece of shit motherfucker." Even today, 40 years later, I believe he would have done it. That was scary. Story 20. My little brothers are twins, fraternal. Matthew is emotional, high-strung, and always getting himself in trouble because he can't keep his mouth shut. Philip is the exact opposite. Very calm, very rational, very quiet. At the time of this story, there were about 10. We lived across the street from the elementary school and I was out of school, so I'd often chill on the front porch with a book and keep an eye on the kids across the street. One day, I hear Matthew's voice start to spin up. I look up and he's facing down some kid, red in the face and about a step from swinging or crying. I'm not sure which. I get up and start to head over, and I've just stepped onto the grass across the street when Matthew's antagonizer says, quite clearly, "Your birth certificate was an apology letter from the abortion clinic." The twins know what an abortion is. Matthew goes silent, shocked and hurt, and tears start to well up in his eyes. I'm furious, and a teeny part of me is laughing because holy shit, the one was new. But before I can say anything, here comes Philip, with a flying punch straight to the side of the kid's head. Knocked him right on his ass. Matthew was shocked out of his tears. I'm flabbergasted over watching a 10-year-old perform an absolutely beautiful airborne sucker punch. Philip stands over the kid, practically snarling until I make it up to them. The kid sees Philip is distracted by me walking up and takes off. I march the twins back home. "I'm kinda proud of you, dude," I tell Philip. "Sticking up for your brother like that?" Philip gives me the flattest look I've ever seen on a child. "I wasn't protecting him," he says. "That's my birth certificate too." Story 21. Twice in 20 years I've seen the fury of my very patient, docile, and kind stepdad. The first time was when some 12th graders chased my brother and cousin all the way from school to our backyard, threatening their lives with pocket knives. Stepdad calmly walked to the backyard, grabbed the big kids by their throats, and lifted them, pinning them to the fence. "Stay the hell away from my kids," was all he said, in a calm, teeth-biting kind of way. The kids booked it faster than I've ever seen anyone run, and never bugged my brother or cousin again. Then we all went inside and made burgers. The second time was in my angsty preteen years when I called my mother a bitch. He turned at me and I'd never been so scared in my life. This time he was right pissed and screamed at me until I was backed up against our bar counter, shielding myself with the bar stool legs. The second he backed off slightly, I booked it into my bedroom and barricaded myself in with all the furniture I could find. Didn't come out for a solid day until I got up the courage to apologize. But he's a teddy bear normally. Story 22. My dad, about a decade ago while I was in high school, we lived on a hill, and if you go down the hill, it leads into the main part of town where all the shops and stuff are. And if you go up, over the other side, it's where a lot of the bars and clubs are. It's quicker to go over than around, obviously. But then my parents each had a car instead of sharing one and only one space in the garage, and drunk idiots were constantly damaging Mom's car. Well, one night Dad happened to have a day off fall on the weekend, and he could hear a group of drunk people walking up the road. His little office or computer room is at the very front of the house, so he gets up, goes out the front door, and just waits near the front lawn, watching. They're being loud and pushing each other around. Mom's worried as fuck and comes to get me because she doesn't want him to get hurt by some drunk idiot, and I go out to see what he's doing. They end up pushing each other around more, and one bump into the car or is leaning on it, in the hood of the car. Dad tells them to get away from it. They start taunting him, so he walks closer toward them, and one of the little bastards cleanly smashes the side mirror off while laughing at him. Dad is a 6-foot ex-basketballer, basically just all-around fucking huge, and is a small man bait in a normal day. Dad hit him straight in the jaw, and you could see his jaw completely broken. Guy's immediately screaming and bawling his eyes out at the same time, while his friends pick him up and run away. Never heard from them again, or got any trouble for it. Dad just went back inside and watched TV. Yeah, let's break the mirror off the 6'8" guy's car. Sounds like a good idea.